Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode in this series. Now, first, I want to get into something that is, I want to thank Titan and CreeperFreak for helping me with this video and with the information because the first half was checked by Titan, and for the second half I am going to use a list that was written by CreeperFreak a little while ago. So thanks again to those people for helping me with the video. And now let's get right into something else. And that is the mistakes section of the last video, because I did in fact forget some stuff as I kinda expected, to be honest. For example, when talking about the bridge, I didn't mention the pilot, and I also never mentioned the steering engine for the rudder. So yeah, there are two things that I did forget, but hey, nobody's perfect, okay? But now it's time to jump right into today's topics. First, we're gonna actually look into storage and what all of these storerooms are actually about, because I only gave that a passing mention, but I didn't tell you guys what storerooms I'm actually talking about. So let's first jump into food storerooms, something I mentioned very early on last episode, and that contains eggs, ice cream, ice making machines, fruits, vegetables, groceries, flour, cheeses, cold drinks, champagne and wines, westbound beef, eastbound beef, thawing room, mutton, fish, poultry, empties, and cold bulk store. Now let's get into some of these rooms. Obviously, the ice making machine rooms make this ice cream. Often it's actually not a room. For example, in Titanic, it was just a little bit of a platform where these machines stood on. And another room that might confuse you is the thawing room, which is basically just for warming up the meat after it was stored in the rooms, and it's often right next to the meat storerooms. And empties store empty bottles and stuff, I guess. Now, another type of storeroom you might want to have on your ship, now this is a little optional, that is mail rooms. And if you have a mailroom on board that requires a mailroom and a post office, mailroom being the bigger storeroom down below, and the post office being more of a organizing area, I guess. And something you also need to bear in mind: if you have a mailroom on board, your ship has to have the prefix RMS instead of SS, because it's now a Royal Mail ship. And if it's a German liner, it's RPD. That means Reichspostdampfer, and it's basically the same thing or like the English equivalent, but it's for German ships. The two last things you really need to bear in mind is baggage, and each class needs to have a separate baggage hold, so that's something to keep in mind. Now, this is only the case for a little later ships, so around 1870s, 80s, 90s, that when ships really started to grow in size, this started to become common. And something you also need is cargo rooms for products being shipped between continents. And yeah, these cargo rooms also need hatches on older ships, and on like 30s, 40s liners, it started to become common that there were hull doors on the side ships. And around that time, garages also started to become common, where you can drive right into the ship and you have, yeah, an area just for cars only, basically. On some ships, it was on the top deck, which was a little bit more bulky, but yeah, that started to be introduced then. So now let's get into propulsion again, because last time I left that really vague and I didn't go very deep into that, but now with some help I can tell you a lot more. So let's get into some more subcategories. And firstly, let's start at the very beginning of the process with fuel, in most cases coal. Now this coal is in so-called coal bunkers, and these bunkers are later used after the 1920s for oil, so these become oil bunkers. And shortly after, diesel also started to appear around ships, but not all of them. And bear in mind, some of the ships still had coal during this time, so it was a little bit of a mix. And each coal bunker needs a few coal bunker doors on the side of the hull, and there also need to be makeshift platforms mounted a few decks above that, but often these are barely seen, so often just uh, a trapdoor folded up onto the hull is enough for demonstrating that that exists, because they weren't really that noticeable, but they were there. And if you want to have your ships accurate, that's a nice little detail you might want to add. And now for boilers, in the very early stages, around the mid 1800s, there were vertical and horizontal boilers, but a little later on it was only the horizontal type became common basically. And a boiler also needs cooling water, which is often forgotten. Now this is gained from the condensers, which we'll get into later. And you also need some pipe work with steam going out and coolant going in. Now let's get into the engine. There are different engine types. For example, there's the expansion engine, and there's multiple types of this engine. For example, in the middle 1800s it was double or triple expansion. Then around Titanic's time it was triple or quadruple, and later even sextuple expansion engines. And starting with the Lusitania in the 1910s later, the turbines started to become a lot more common and used on ships, and around the 1930s diesel engines also started to pop up. Now when we are talking about these expansion engines, each of these sets is a casing, as it's called, and it also has a little extras extending bit for valves, which is controlled by rods coming up from the propeller shaft. So that's also something to bear in mind. And the main arm going down into the propeller shaft also needs a guide rail, which so it doesn't bob around in the air, which is something that is often forgotten. Now next we are looking to condensers, which is basically, in layman's terms, converts steam into water and also water into steam. And they are used after they turn the rest of the steam that comes out of the main engine into water. It either gets ejected or put back into the boilers for coolant. Now dynamos for electricity are also important. They are often aft of the main engine room, and they also include emergency dynamos that are often way higher up in the ship. So if in an emergency situation and the main dynamo room gets damaged, you still have a few emergency sets so you still have a little bit of power at least. Now you also need some pumps for transporting all of these fluids or the steam through the pipes, so that's also something you shouldn't forget. And something very important you also shouldn't forget is the engine hatch. It should also be big enough so you can replace some big parts of the engines. That's what it is actually for, so the engines can be worked on easier. And something you also need is a CO2 evaporator room and a switchboard. And yeah, that would be everything, or it's mostly everything concerning the engine. Obviously I could go into even more detail, but that is to get you started. Now let's get briefly into the steering engine, which is basically a big gear that comes out from the rudder often on the deck above, and it's connected to two smaller expansion engines. One of them is often main and one of them is often emergency, and they turn this gear so the rudder can turn, which is basically everything that has to do with the steering engine. Now let's get back into public rooms, which is also something I didn't go too much into, and that is what public rooms were common on ships, and yeah, what facilities did each class also expect. So let's get into that. Now I haven't looked at this list too much yet. I've only given it a glance, so I'm gonna see some new stuff myself. Now you obviously need a stairwell. Often this is also a very grand stairwell, the main one anyways. Often times there's also smaller ones dotted around the ship, and this main staircase also needs at least one elevator. And something you also don't want to forget is the main social hall lounge, or whatever you want to call it, because it's quite important. And the smoke room is for the gentlemen, is also basically on every ship, so that's something you shouldn't forget. And also a dining room for eating, that is also an essential. And for the passenger organization, you also need an inquiry office, which is basically for your purses. You also may want a cloakroom, but this is not really that important. And a reception room is also very nice, and it gives basically your first impression. So it's not essential. On some ships I didn't do, on some ships I did do it. It has to do. You can do it if you want to, but if you don't have the space or don't want to, it's fine. Now some essential things are music rooms, reading and writing rooms, and verandas, winter gardens, and cafes, and also an a la carte restaurant, which is basically a restaurant where you have to pay extra onto your ticket price, so you get some much better food and better service overall. Now, something you also need to bear in mind, which is often forgotten, is a barber shop and a ladies' hairdresser and a manicurist, and maybe also some shops. Now, what you can also put on ships is a bar, a ballroom, a gym, or leisurely activities like squash, tennis, or deck games. That is something you can put on a ship, but is not really 100% necessary. Now, you also need hospitals, pharmacies for your patients' health needs, and you can also have some spa things, that is, for example, a swimming bath, possibly an outdoor pool, but that is only on later ships and maybe more tropical climates, cooling rooms, electric baths, steam baths, and shampooing rooms. So that's a nice addition you might want to have on maybe your luxury liner to make it a lot nicer. Now maybe you want to introduce a little bit of a private dining room. Now this is really on only luxury liners. This is for like your little festivities, and sometimes there's also children's dining rooms and children's playrooms, because back then it was very common that children wouldn't dine with their parents, and a nice playroom for them is also a nice idea. Something you might also want to have are deck chair rooms on deck, and you also might want to have a dark candles or maybe a coat room, so you can put in your coats, or your dog. You can put in your dog, so you don't have that running around all the time or something like that. And just to dip your toe into the water a little bit into that area, what you might want to include. Now let's get into second class. Now it needs a lot of the same stuff, but often a little downgraded. So only like social halls or lounges, smoke rooms, dining rooms, maybe a reading room or a gym, but not. That is rarely the case actually. Maybe a private dining room if if they were being nice to you. Now third class has even less. Often time it has only got a general room and a dining room, and yeah, that's maybe an open space, and that's it. And obviously some of the others other facilities. Now something you also want to bear in mind, very early on, third class only had these humongous bunk rooms, but this only stayed the case till around 1900. By that point, everyone had cabins. But later on, for example, like the Imperator class, the fourth class was introduced, which is basically what third class used to be, with the humongous bunk rooms and pretty much the same stuff as third class, but just worse basically. And lastly, for crew, you also might want to have at least some facilities, but oftentimes the crew only had like a smoke room and maybe a general room. However, on a lot later ships like the 30s and 40s or something like that, they got a lot more stuff that for them, but that is basically it's not as clearly put as some of the other areas I've looked at today, because you can basically decide yourself what you want to give them a little bit. So especially on 30 ships you can give them a little more, and maybe some deck space, maybe a nicer restaurant, maybe a bar or something like that, maybe a little bit of a karaoke bar or something like that, just something so they can also get some entertainment and such. So that's basically a little bit of your own creativity what matters there. And yeah, that would basically be it for today. I hope you liked the second part of the series. Again, thank you to Titan and CreeperFreak for helping me in this video. And yeah, you might also want to watch the first video if you're not a little confused. And yeah, I also proposed some other stuff, so just go looking on my channel, maybe you'll find something interesting. Now, if you like this video, leave a like, maybe a comment if you want to say something, subscribe if you liked it really that much, and yeah, have a good day everyone.